So I'm Ali Murtaza. I'll be, the topic I'm speaking on today is reframing the next billion users. And by way of a quick introduction, I'm currently leading the service design practice at Ideate Innovation, which is a human-centered design firm based in Islamabad, Pakistan. Previously, I've led design teams at an agri-tech company, Recult, and another tech company based in Lahore. I've also worked with tech companies and startups in Pakistan and the US. And I have a master's in industrial design from Savannah College of Art and Design. So I'll quickly go through a few of the projects that I worked on in the past, which sets the frame for a lot of the conversation that we'll have later on. So one of the projects that I worked on about 3 years ago was as part of redesigning the childhood immunization system of Punjab. Punjab is the biggest, most populous province in Pakistan. So, and there was a large government initiative on redesigning the way the whole immunization program worked. And I was responsible for a small part of it. But one of the core parts of that task or focuses of that task was to communicate the importance of immunizations and vaccinations generally to mostly illiterate audiences. So we went from, we had to communicate why people should care that their kids get vaccinated, and also to give the mostly illiterate users or parents enough power in that conversation that they could hold government representatives responsible and healthcare representatives responsible for not doing their job. So a lot of this, all of the work in this was around visual communication. So the diagram at the back is basically one that we came up with, in which we matched the color of the vaccination to a different body part on or like an anatomical diagram of a kid, so that you can visually make the connection between, okay, if my kid gets this vaccination or doesn't get this vaccination, this part of their body might be compromised. So that was a way that we communicated a lot of that healthcare information in this project. And there were other parts, of course, in this. And mine was obviously a small role in the large project, but overall the project was a large success. It's still carrying on in a different, in a slightly sort of iterated way, but it's been one of the been credited as being one of the core reasons behind Punjab's vaccination program or record turning around over the last half a decade or so. Another project that I would quickly introduce was in finance and technology. And I worked as a consultant with Great Impact, which is a Colorado-based design firm. And we worked in Pakistan to figure out how to potentially design financial inclusion services for unbanked women in Pakistan. So this, again, is a fairly similar audience in terms of financial and tech literacy, but the focus was on finances. So understanding how their current relationship with technology as well as finances, and then designing systems that they could use. And this again took a lot of visual communication work, where we had to see what icons worked for them. How do we communicate fairly complex financial concepts to people who, for one, couldn't read or write very well, and two, hadn't been introduced to them before. So a lot of this was about understanding their current mental models and then seeing what sort of visual language worked for them. And this has been documented in a few different places, and one of them is on Fast Company, that you can read some of the lessons that came out of this. A project that I worked on for about 1.5 years was in agri-tech. With a focus on smallholder farmers in the developing world. And we made some digital products to help them make better decisions. And this is a startup that started out of MIT, but has offices in Pakistan, Thailand, and the US. And most of our functions are in Pakistan and Thailand, which again, despite being developing countries, have very different agricultural landscapes. So within that, we had to design products that worked not just in one, but both countries. And again, we're in an industry where taking up technology is actually, the uptake of technology isn't that fast. A lot of the people using, especially smallholder farmers, using different techniques are using them because they've been passed down through generations. So suddenly somebody wants to promote some technology and tells them to adapt the technology and change the way they do their work, when that's been the way they've done their work for generations, is a really hard sell. And so unless we understand exactly how they think and why they make the decisions that they make, we're never going to design any technology that they can trust. So a lot of this research and development of this technology was around really understanding the user and then developing things that they could not just understand but also trust, because there's and their whole livelihood is connected to the decisions that they make on this. So a lot of that is about trusting what we're telling them. So there's this again came started out of MIT, so that's you can read about this on some of their blogs. But also Recult has till now raised around $5 million in funding. Recently raised pre-Series A, so they're trying to move towards sort of Series A with a lot of their current income coming in from the Thailand operations and mostly from their B2B platforms, which were running in parallel to the B2C. This is a project that Ideate worked on with IDEO.org, Ideate.org, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was around studying financial agency of women in Pakistan. And this again overlaps with one of the earlier projects that I shared. But one thing that we have learned in our research over the years is that if you go research with the same group of people, let's say 6 months with 6 months from now that you researched with today, their insights and the stuff that works for them or doesn't work for them will change. So even though there was a lot of overlap between this and the earlier project I shared, a lot of the insights actually weren't as applicable between the two. So and then in this, there was a lot of around 60 to 70 hours of field research, just again understanding how the relationship between that these women had with finances and with technology, as well as their environment. So then trying to see where the interventions can be placed that women can get access to, can trust, and would actually want to use. So these are all things that you only get when you understand the user's context. And so a lot of the research in this was around those areas. Ideate.org did this, conducted similar, or sort of this was part of a bigger project which was being conducted in 6 countries. And they have documentation of this available through those 6 different programs. And Ideate worked on the one in Pakistan. One of the bigger projects early on that Ideate worked on was Pakistan's biggest social safety net, which is the Benazir Income Support Program. And Ideate worked on understanding how the current system worked, and then redesigning and prototyping cash withdrawal systems for those users. So again, the audience was predominantly low income because those are the people who qualify for this, actually almost exclusively low income. And a lot of them were also women. So this again is about understanding those users who may not feel very comfortable using technology and also don't have much access to it otherwise. So try to understand them in designing a system which then works for them. And this has been so far, this is still one of the biggest safety net programs in Pakistan. Another project that we're currently working on is in contraceptive uptake, post-pregnancy care and contraceptive uptake. And this is ongoing at Ideate. And one of the things about this project is that because it covers a lot of areas that are taboo in our part of the world, this takes researching in this takes a lot of understanding of nuances of the culture, of the context, as well as a lot of experience with how to conduct that research. And this project was 4 years ago, with the whole firm having less experience on research, I don't think we could have done this project. And that's sort of the thing that you learn over time, is understanding, even though we are all from the same place, Pakistan, where this is being conducted, and you have to understand the context at a level that's deep enough, but also then know your research techniques through practice deeply enough to be able to execute something complicated like this. So I've shared a few projects which were in healthcare, agri-tech, as well as financial inclusion. So there's something connecting all of these. And one of the ways, well, there are multiple things connecting these, but one of the ways they're connected is what you might call the next billion users. You could essentially put the users of all of these projects in one way or the other in a bracket that's become known as the next billion users. And I'm assuming some of you might have heard this term before. But I'll also go over this just in a bit. So there are a lot of programs going on around the world around the next billion users. And the concept is that in the next 18 months, there will be 1 billion new users on the internet. And that will obviously keep repeating. probably at a faster pace. So as we get more and more new people onto the internet, the whole landscape of how the internet works and who's on it, what they consume, keeps changing. So we can't keep designing products and our processes the way we were designing 10 years ago or even a year ago. So the way anyone who's designing a digital product that interacts with the internet, they're interacting with an ever evolving thing or entity, which we need to understand. And for that, a lot of different companies and technology companies and firms have started really focusing on this next billion user landscape. And one of them, probably the most well-known, is Google's initiative on the next billion users. And while I think that this is a really important area to work in, trying to understand who those users are, how to design products for them, and all of that, I also think that the way a lot of this is framed is really problematic. I think that a lot of the way we talk about the next billion users is actually counterproductive to us designing good products for them. And that's largely the focus of what I'm talking about. So I think one of the reasons why we often sort of frame the next billion users in a way that doesn't work is because it's really difficult to get your head around how big a billion is. So you might say Jeff Bezos has $100 billion. I don't really know how big a billion is. Like, I can't imagine it in my head. And that's true, I think, for most people. You may be able to imagine 100 things sitting next to each other, maybe even 100,000 people. You can imagine a big stadium. But how do you imagine in your head 100,000 people, then 1,000,000 people, then 1,000 million, which is a billion? So when you talk about a billion people and you're talking about them as a user base, it just becomes an abstract number, which we don't really think of as, we don't really understand the problems associated with. So I wanted to do a quick exercise here. Has anyone read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy? I know this seems like a jump, but I promise I'll get back to the gist. Has anyone read the book? Oh.
Not me.
Okay. I haven't read it either, to be fair. I'm guessing most people would have heard of it, but very few people probably have read it. And it's one of the most famous books by the title and also the author, but very few people have read it. And one of the reasons for that is that it has close to 600,000 words. For reference, the whole Harry Potter series has something like 800,000. So this is 3/4 of the way to a whole series, but inside one book. And the point being, it's a gigantic book that most people can't get through. And it has about less than 600,000 words. So if you read that book every month, like if you took a month to read War and Peace, that would take a lot of commitment. You would still have to read it 1,700 times to reach 1 billion words. So if you read one of the biggest books in the English language 1,700 times, you would reach 1 billion words of reading, which I don't think any of us will ever do in our lifetimes. So that's sort of the scale of how big the number billion is. And now imagine that each of those words is a person. So you start reading the book, War and Peace, that's 3 people. There are, I don't know, 6 people on this call right now. So the title of the book will already cover the people on this call. So that's sort of, I just wanted to relate the scale of how, when we say 1 billion people, what that means. And of course, they're spread all over the world, but predominantly the next billion after the current parts of the world. So there's South Asia, where I am. There's North Africa, Central Africa. There's some in Central Asia, and then there's the Caribbean. So these are the regions where a lot of these people who will join the internet for the first time over the next year will come from. So I thought we could look at one of those little dots right here and see what's inside those. So that's Lahore. That's a city I'm originally from. That's a city of about 20 million people. And sort of south of that, we won't look at Lahore. Let's go south of that. There's a small town / village called Khudian Khas. So let's zoom into Khudian Khas and meet this guy who is about 60 years old. He is a farmer by trade. His sons now work on his fields. He's a smallholder farmer. But one of the interesting things about him is that he kind of looks like a caricature of a Pakistani farmer, especially a Punjabi farmer. So he looks sort of wise, So he's been used by various agriculture companies in Pakistan as sort of their mascot. So he's been on TV ads, he's been on WhatsApp videos, Facebook campaigns. He's sort of kind of a face of various agriculture products. So he's a minor celebrity in his town. So people look at him, people see his videos, people think of him as like a sage of some kind in the agriculture space, even though he doesn't really practice agriculture on a daily basis. So he's sort of a minor celebrity. It's just an interesting story. Then there's this guy who's in a similar age bracket. He also started off as a relatively smallholder farmer, but over time, with his savings, built a larger, got more land, and over time invested that, and has been successful enough to fund his children's education. Two of them now, I think one of them now studies in Australia, and one of them is a doctor there. So, and he himself is not really literate. So he's super proud of his achievements, and he's done that kind of out with all his hard work in this little town. There's this guy who's, I think, 21 years old. He just got his first smartphone when we met him. And he can't read or write. He can read numbers, but can't read letters, which is fairly common for a lot of the users that we work with. So he's really enthusiastic about the internet, but he's just learning how to use it. But a lot of his predominant. Christopher, could you mute your mic? So a lot of his current use is on WhatsApp and Facebook, and he uses those mostly with voice notes and posting and looking at pictures. But he's just learning the ropes of how the internet works. So he's sort of like the ideal. He just joined the last billion that came onto the internet. On the other side, there's a young lady in that town who is a school teacher, who again only recently got a smartphone and learned how the internet worked and all of that. But because she is educated, she's now sort of become like the tech guru for a lot of the local women. She understands how her phone works, so she helps other people out with theirs. And she's a school teacher, just learned how technology works, but now immediately is kind of like in a leadership role within that community. Sorry. This one's really interesting. So she is around 60 years old. I met her a while ago, and she again can only read numbers and can't write at all. But she never used a smartphone before. But she has a feature phone. So a lot of the times when we want to learn how people use technology, we just ask them to show us something. So she showed us her phone, and I asked her what she can do on it, and she said, "Oh, I can call people and I attend calls." And the conversation went on. We found out that she had basically built up a system for saving a lot of numbers in her phone that she could call just like we do on our contact list, right? But the interesting thing was she was doing this without using any letters at all because she can't read those. So I asked her to save my number, for instance, and she saves it. And the last two numbers of my phone number are 60. So she saves my number, and then she's like, "Oh, you're 60." So she remembers the last two numbers for every person that she saves. And if two numbers end up on the same, or two phone numbers end up on the same last two numbers, then she adds an emoji, which were the 16 by 16 pixel emojis that we had on feature phones. She would add that to one of those numbers. So that gives her, I don't know, a few thousand slots that she can fill in her contact list and actually recall all of them without ever using letters. So she had this really smart system, and which we also learned other people also use. So that's sort of a workaround around technology that certain users have figured out that the designers of those technologies probably didn't really think of. So this was a really interesting sort of learning experience for us. So the point of all of that was, I showed you 5 different people, from the older semi-celebrity guy to the local school teacher to this lady. A little question: how many personas would you divide these 5 people into if you had to design, say, a digital product for them? Is there a comment section people can post in? I'm trying to see. Okay, 1 for each of them. Okay, so that makes it 5 different personas. If anyone has any other suggestions, you can write in the chat. And then we get back to Leo Tolstoy. Okay, so even if we do one of them, that's 5 personas. Maybe you may clump a couple of people together. You might say 3 or 4 personas, but those 5 people are multiple personas, and you can't really. The point being, sort of the thing you see is that reducing them to one is really difficult. And if you do that, you probably won't design a product that works for any of them. So back to War and Peace. So these are the first 5 words of War and Peace: well, Prince, so Genoa, and these are basically 5 people in that small town. So the 5 people I showed you are, if you imagine them back to that analogy of War and Peace being people, those 5 words would be the 5 people I showed you. And a billion people later, how many personas would those become? So the first 5 we've seen already are multiple personas. And those obviously, all of them are from that little town, in this little dot, inside that dot, spread around the world. And then we, as designers and as technologists, have this weird obsession with treating all of them as one user base or one persona of some sort. And we want to design products that work for all of them. And you'll see, if you look it up, you'll see articles on 3 ways to design for the next billion users, 7 ways of designing for the next billion users. It's really, I think, really, it's almost funny at this point when you meet people who are so different from each other in the same place. And then you see somebody outside treating all of the million people around them also as one specific user. Of course, that doesn't mean all of these programs themselves are flawed. It's just the framing that I think that comes out of these that often becomes problematic. Okay, so, but on the other hand, if we do actually learn about people, we do treat them as individuals, we go meet them, what happens? We learn about them, we learn from them. So I'll share some of the learnings that I've had over the last few years working with audiences similar to the ones I showed you examples of. And one of them was a problem really early on. This was my first time designing for a low-tech, low-literate audience in Pakistan. And one of the challenges was that our app needed to work in both English and Urdu, which is true for most of the products I've worked on. And so let's just talk about this. So the English language goes from left to right, and Urdu goes from right to left. Urdu uses a variation of the Arabic script. So that's sort of, you might have seen that. So yeah, it goes in a different direction to English. So when we started designing, or I started designing with my team, the first app that we were going to have in both languages, our assumption was that since English goes this way and Urdu is that way, any guesses where the Urdu, if there was a forward icon in the app, which was in English, it would go in this direction from left to right. Any guesses to where the forward icon would be pointing in an Urdu app? One of them, each of them, or the opposite? Yeah, so that was exactly our assumption as well. And again, this is me coming with my fancy design degree and 3 other designers who had designed products and kind of were happy with themselves with their design education. All of us were like, okay, of course the whole sequence will shift. Turns out it didn't. So none of our users actually understood that the forward icon was forward when we flipped it. And there's a simple reason for this was that most of them had only really been seeing icons like these either on boards that were in both languages. So a lot of signage in Pakistan is in English and Urdu. And of course, your direction in real life doesn't change based on which language you're reading, right? So if you say left turn ahead, whether it's written in English or Urdu, the direction remains the same. And when they use a phone, the Androids that they used had a native back button, which always remained the same direction. So to them, forward was just left to right and back was right to left on a phone. It didn't really matter which language they were using. That was our bias as people who read books and have the kind of being over smart, try to overthink the problem and coming up with our solution. Thankfully, we tested this with enough people and found out that our whole app would have been the wrong way around, because this was also a financial transactions app. So money going and money coming back has a direction in people's minds. So we would have flipped every direction if we didn't get to know people. So if anyone's seen any Borat movies, you would know translations are really important. And those are really important when you're designing applications, multilingual applications as well. So this is one of the things that, like one fascinating example, the word okay, the abbreviation, I guess, okay, is something that appears in quite a lot of apps, just as a when you want to finish an interaction or wherever it may be. So if you go to Google Translate, the way it translates is it says TK, which literally translates to everything's okay or it's okay. So yeah, that's the literal translation. And we've seen that a lot of Urdu apps that we have in Pakistan do use the word TK for the translation for okay. What we found out though in our research was that people's translation for okay was okay. Because okay is such a common term and they've seen it so many times written exactly like that, that it isn't two letters to them anymore, it's a symbol. Just like that arrow means the right, it's a symbol. Similarly, okay is just a symbol at this point for people, at least the users that we were interacting with. So we could actually save a lot of space on our buttons by just writing okay because everyone understood them. We didn't actually have to write the whole Arabic, or Urdu, which was much longer. And they also, whenever they saw tick mark or check mark, they also called that the OK button, which again gave us a prompt. Okay, we can just use that symbol as well to replace OK, and we don't actually need to go with the actual translation. So, and this is a very common, I think, very commonly overlooked when designing multilingual apps. People just use whatever the actual real translation is, rather than what people understand to be the word. One really interesting one was loan. This is for an app where you could apply for a loan through a banking solution, and we had to find out the Urdu word for this. And again, if you look at Google Translate, it will translate it to qarz, which is the Urdu word for loan. But qarz also has some negative connotations in the Pakistani context. A lot of Pakistanis are practicing Muslims, and Islam doesn't prohibits interest, and qarz has connotations of interest. Even if you say interest-free loan, the word loan, when translated to qarz, has connotations that are to do with interest, which people want to avoid, and also they can't afford it. However, if we use so that's the literal translation. So if we use the word udhar, which again also means loan colloquially, that word, because that's not a formal translation and it isn't used in the formal banking system, people are more comfortable with. And if I borrowed some money from my friend, I would usually use this word rather than the earlier word. And that using that word made people more comfortable with the concept of taking a loan, even though none of the actual specifications of the process changed. Just the word made people more comfortable, so they were more likely to click it. This is one of the ones that I find the most fascinating. It's also really difficult to explain, but I'll try. So My Farms was a button that we had in our app for the agri-tech application. But in Urdu, if you translate in My Farms, it just becomes mere khet, mere being my and khet being farms, which makes perfect sense. So there's no other real translation you can do for this. So that's what we went with. What we noticed was a really interesting concept, which I would love to explore more in the future. But this we came across quite a few times, so we wanted to document it. And that was when that a lot of our users, when they saw the words Mere Khet or My Farms, part of it, the app saying that these were the app's farms. So they were thinking of the app speaking in the first person, saying My Farms. So the farms belonged to the app rather than the person. But when we changed that to Your Farms, when the button said Your Farms, people understood that the app was talking to them and saying, oh, these are your farms. So that made more sense to them. So somehow in English, My Farms was fairly instinctively thought of as the users, whereas when we translated that literally to Urdu, people couldn't get that this was the my in that was a user. So we changed My Farms to Your Farms, which then translates to Uptake Hit. So in English, you'll see My Farms, but in Urdu, you'll see the translation for Your Farms. And this is a really strange mental model that I want to explore much more. Strange in the sense of surprising. So I want to really explore if there's a linguistic reason for this. I'm not really sure. Then, of course, there's symbols that don't always translate or don't always follow the rules that we may come in with. And one of them was in one of the projects, one of our apps that we built, we had a question mark icon in the top right. And I would assume that most of you would click on that icon if you wanted help from a screen. However, when we were user testing our mockups, we would ask people if they got stuck on a certain screen. We would ask them if they can find something that could help them on the screen, and almost no one was clicking on this question mark button. And this is 4 or 5 years ago. This might have changed by now. I'm not really sure, but very few people clicked on this. And when we prompted them saying that, oh, this is the button that you can click on to get help, why were you not clicking on this? Some of the answers that we received were along the lines of, oh, if I click on this, the app will ask me a question. So to them, the question mark icon wasn't them asking a question, it was the app will ask me a question. So that again, and it makes perfect sense, because where do you see question marks? At the end of questions. So we've just learned that in a digital world, a question mark means that I'm getting my questions answered. But actually, like most of the time when you see a question mark, you're being asked a question. So that was a lot of our users' perception as well. What they preferred, even though our app did not actually make a call anywhere, it was basically tooltips. So you click on it, a tooltip pops up saying what's on the screen and how you can use it. And there's a speaker icon where you can hear that tooltip. But what they preferred for this was sort of this call center icon, because they think of help or asking for help as being a call center. So yeah, that was the sort of icon that they preferred. Actually, more specifically, they preferred this icon because both male and female users said that the female icon works better for them. And the reason for that was women said that they'll be more comfortable if the phone has a recorded voice and that's of a female. So if the tooltip is heard in a female's voice, they're more comfortable with it. While the men said they just wanted to hear the female talk to them. So we as researchers just need to follow what our users tell us. So for both of our genders, this icon was sort of what we put forward. So yeah, our assumption would be that this is the sort of context that works. If you have a female there to help you, both male and female users are more comfortable, especially females. So that's something, learning that we can take forward into more projects. However, we learned that this doesn't necessarily mean, or this doesn't necessarily apply to different contexts, even if we are working with similar users. So in the earlier project that I shared with Ideate, which Ideate worked on, one of the learnings was that one of the propositions from us was that we could have female mobile money agents at shops, so that people, for our female audience or users, could be more comfortable interacting with them. But almost unanimously, all of them were against the idea of having female mobile money agents at shops. And the reasons for these are, there are multiple reasons for this. We won't go into them in detail, but a lot of that came down to people were just interested in getting the job done. And if the male mobile money agent was already doing a job, it's fine, they can interact with them. So that wasn't a problem. Again, in the earlier version where we were just looking at a screen where you'd clicked and heard a voice, both genders preferred a female. That was another project. Similar audience, different project, in a physical space, they were okay with the male mobile money agent and were fairly did not want the female mobile money agent position to be created. So one thing we could potentially get out of this is that a female operator is fine as long as they're behind a phone. That could be one thing that we learned from both projects. Or more accurately, we could say that there are different answers based on what the exact context is. So even if we're working with a similar audience on a similar problem, in fintech, about help, the answer changes based on the exact context that we are in. So, and sometimes the answer will be in a completely different place that we hadn't even considered. Coming back to our translations and language, one really interesting thing was when I was, a lot of the examples I gave you were from this fintech app that we were working on, and we worked really hard on getting the translations right and all of that. But what we also learned was that most of our users who couldn't read English or understand English very well wanted the app to open in English by default. And this was again counterintuitive. We had all assumed the opposite. But what we learned, and which made sense afterwards, was that because in a Pakistani context, especially with lower income groups, mobile phones are a status symbol. Actually, with every group, I guess. So people who can only really afford a feature phone will have an entry level smartphone. People who can only afford an entry level smartphone will actually have a mid tier smartphone, and so on, because it's an investment not just in the product but in their own the way they portray themselves to the world. And unfortunately, English is also a status symbol. So people who care about their image enough to invest in a smartphone when they potentially probably don't get a benefit that they can justify from it, also care about how they're perceived and if they're perceived to know English. So we spoke to a few of these users, and they said that the app opening in English will give the people around them the idea that they know how to use apps in English, and that's good for their ego, which is sort of again connected to the point that they also have a smartphone for potentially for similar reasons. So it makes sense when we got to understand the point. And again, if we hadn't spoken to them, our app would almost definitely open in Urdu by default. So now we've gone through, spoken about a few different users, seen how many variations of answers we get for different kinds of users, depending on exact contexts. I hope that this sort of framing of the next billion as one seems as absurd to you guys as it does to me when it is framed this way. So what happens when we fail to see people as individuals? Of course, I've talked about like all the things we wouldn't have learned if we just went out and said, oh, I've worked with, say, low-income groups in Pakistan before. This is a similar audience. These are my 10 learnings. Let's apply them to this new group. That we could have done that. We can still keep doing that. But none of our learnings, or as our learnings show, we probably would have designed products that were basically unusable. So what happens is we build products that no one can use, and then we spend a lot of time correcting our mistakes. And there are so many examples of these products, especially in the development sector, where products were made because some grant wanted a very specific kind of execution, and a lot of the research was then used or framed in a way so that it could justify the grant, and the work that's done on the field was actually just useless. And then you spend you see the results aren't coming in, you spend more money correcting those mistakes. And so on. And that this is an example that's happened over decades in the developing world. But I think more importantly, we also dehumanize people when we treat them as this clump of a billion people who are one. The definition of dehumanizing is to address or portray someone in a way that obscures or demeans that person's humanity or individuality. And I think that's exactly what we do when we think of say, oh, these are the global South, and these are the low-income people or the poor, even in an even worse framing. And we are some sort of saviors who are designing products for them, and we're gonna change their lives because we know what they want. It's taking every form of humanity and agency away from them. And that also, I think, over a longer period of time, when that keeps happening, and this is a problem with a lot of the aid world and the development sector, is that it's a form of othering, which is to treat or view a person or group of people as intrinsically different from ourselves. So we think that, what do we use our phones for? I use them for mine for YouTube, WhatsApp, some other social, Instagram, talking to my friends, mostly that. But somehow I think that if I give a smartphone to a person who's in a lower income bracket to me, they will suddenly use all the utilities to help to figure out their lives, which again, I'm just thinking of them as not being like me. I'm thinking of them as being inherently different. So we think that the only barrier between their problems and our solutions is a lack of smartphone applications. This happens pretty much all over the world. I think Silicon Valley is responsible for a lot of this, but also like the development aid sector, where people have a clean water problem, give them a smartphone app for that. People have healthcare problems, design an app for that. So the starting point becomes the app, and you don't actually end up caring about what the actual problem was. Maybe the solution is the app, but you get to that after understanding the problem and working with them rather than applying the app to their problems. We also think that the next billion users will somehow use the internet in more productive ways than we do. This again comes back to the same point. We use the internet mainly for entertainment, at least on our phones. And we somehow think that these people who are working much harder than us, have much harder lives than us, will have this device which will for the first time give them access to the world's entertainment, and they will somehow use it for more utilitarian reasons. It makes no sense. And this is a point that Payal Arora in her book, The Next Billion Users, brings up and really talks about in a really nice, nuanced way. We think that a billion people from around the world who speak hundreds of different languages can somehow be treated as one. But each of us, communicating in one language, English, using the same software, Zoom, at an event based on a shared interest, customer experience, are all interesting whole individuals. So if I told any of the people in this conference to design a product that worked equally for all, I don't know, 100 and something people, and treating them as one persona, you'd think I was crazy. But somehow we do that all the time to the next billion users or any user base approaching that sort of framing. I think we're full of ourselves. And the we are here is designers, technologists, development consultants, a lot of people working in solving these problems. I think we treat our biases or our frames as being superior to the people we're actually designing for. I think we need to pause and reconsider everything we do in this sector. We need to start small. For instance, if I can't clean up my apartment, I probably shouldn't be designing applications for cleaning up the world's oceans, and so on. And we should get to know people before we design for them. Thank you. And you can okay. You can go to ideateinnovation.com or connect with me on LinkedIn at Ali Murtaza. And thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Hi, Ali. This is Daniel.
Hey.
I found really interesting what you said about people using an app that they cannot even write or read. So this really fascinated me. Do you have any advice how to tackle this? Are there any initiatives from your side? Is it like only iconographic language the way to go, or could you go maybe a bit deeper on that?
Yeah, so I think again, icons as well as pictures. Actually, interestingly, what we've also learned in quite a few projects is that even when we use icons, we often tend to default to the icons that we are familiar with. So material design and all these different types of icons. For instance, that question mark is an example. But those same icons don't work necessarily for the same user base, right? So even in those icons, we often have to go much more realistic. So it becomes more like illustrations rather than icons at that point. So even when we use that, it's a different way to use them. So that's definitely one. I think audio is a really big part of it. We have, and this is something that a lot of people are working on around the world, the audio, if we can get good audio interaction into apps, it will kind of be, I think, the holy grail of user experience for a lot of these users. There are some problems with that. One of them being that a lot of people in that target group also have phones that don't have as much capacity. They have limited data, both of which curtail the use of audio. So if you can have just enough audio prompts in your app that don't take up too much space and bandwidth, that's probably the best thing to sort of work with alongside icons and imagery. So yeah, audio, I think, is the next really big thing that we should be working towards. Just has some, actually Google's working on a couple of really cool projects in trying to bring audio, make that sort of audio prompts and all of that more accessible to cheaper phones with lower bandwidths.
So that would mean, listening to prompts, but also giving voice commands.
Yeah. So that I should have said two-way communication is sort of like would be ideal. So we're starting off with one-way right now, but again, you can imagine as soon as it's two-way, you have to understand not just the content, but there will be different accents, different languages. Just understanding them again, potentially using a cheaper phone with lack of data is going to be really hard. So a lot of the focus right now is in that audience is still one way, but over time, most people are of the belief that in the coming few years, as all of those technologies become cheaper, that two-way communication becomes much, much more plausible. But yeah, so firstly, starting off slowly, potentially with one way, and then building up to that.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, please let me know.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
Talking about personas, you said like we cannot treat this billion as one, but what would be a good number or what would be a good approach? Because Norman Nielsen group, they say, okay, you should test with 5 people. But if these 5, they should represent different segments, I suppose, or different target areas. Yeah, I would be a bit lost on that part.
No, that's a very good question. And frankly, I'm also lost on that because I don't know how to design anything. Actually, I would say probably 5 years earlier, I would have been really confident that I can at some point design apps for like 1 billion people. But the more I get to know the complexity between different users, the less confident I am. So at this point, I think just the task of being able to design an app that works for all of those billion is sort of like you're taking up too much. So I'm sorry if that doesn't really answer your question, but my focus there is that if you can design something for a segment within that billion, which potentially has more in common with each other than just being, oh, these are all at the same income bracket, because that's really what is currently the most common thing about those billion. If you can break it down further and say this project works on this specific sliver of that billion, which also has this other thing in common, for instance, maybe language, maybe cultural backgrounds, maybe religious backgrounds, you start coming up with some almost solvable personas within that. But beyond that, I'm not really sure there's any product that can be designed to work for them. And the classic, actually, talking of that, there are products obviously that work that people use. For instance, WhatsApp is something that a lot of people just who are new to the internet start using. Facebook then starts becoming one of them as well. But what we've noticed in our research is that a lot of those apps, people learn through a lot of trial and error. Or just give me a second. I need to open the door. Just give me a second. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think I was saying, yeah, so for instance, with WhatsApp and Facebook and these apps that people do use, what we've noticed is that they are almost like projects for them. So they'll have people who, like they'll in the community who are using these apps, who they will learn from. There's a lot of incentive to using them, because once they use them, they've certainly opened themselves up to a lot of things that their people around them do. So a lot of those social pressures come in, and that teaches them those apps. So it's not that Facebook is suddenly designed so well that everyone can use it. It's that they put in so much effort that your app or my app probably isn't going to be to get that level of commitment from people. That Facebook or WhatsApp do. Yeah, I'm sorry that wasn't a direct answer to your question, but that's sort of like the frank answer was I don't really know.
It's great. It's great. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.